management there. And
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
So, Stephen, to get started, let's do a quick meditation. So just kind of collecting yourself, settling into your seat. You can close your eyes and just start to tune into your breath and the quality of your breath right now without a need to shift or change or manipulate the breath. You're just watching and observing your breath like you would watch the ocean. Rooting down through your sit bones, grow tall through the crown of your head, finding a little more space between the vertebrae of your spine, rooting into the seat so that you can find integrity in your back. And then just take a moment to set an intention for this conversation for the next 45 minutes. And then when you're ready, just start to blink your eyes open, taking in the light, taking in your space, taking in the screen.
That was lovely. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So to get started, we'll do some icebreakers, and then we'll move into the topic of the day. So to get started, what do you find sexy about your partner and those who you are interested in?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So wow, we just jump into it with the icebreakers, don't we? What I find sexy about my partner, she's my partner of 30 years. And we happened to have married something like 19 years ago. And what I find sexy about her is the ever growing level of intimacy that allows both of us to be free to express every thought without any kind of inhibition. So maybe one of my secret fears is, my goal is to make sexuality safe for everybody to talk about. One of my secret fears is I'll make it so safe that it'll become boring and I'll go down in history as the guy who made sex boring. I don't want to be that guy, but it is, it's not like I don't love, her looks and, the way she flirts with me and all the other titillating aspects of our attraction to anyone. But for me, the big thing that has kept it vibrant for 30 years has been this feeling of freedom that comes from feeling so safe.
I love that. Actually, that's funny because I recently had asked my partner, what's the most romantic thing I've done for him? And he responded, when you told me this was a safe space.
Yeah, that's exactly. See, we men are scared of you.
What would the perfect day look like for you?
I'm going to, again, arouse, I think, a lot of resentment because I'm actually living a pretty perfect life. And I've described it to my friends and my clients when they ask as living on this endless voyage on the ultimate cruise ship where everything just feels perfectly tailored to my needs and expectations. And part of that, of course, is spiritually lowering my expectations or modifying them to accept life on life's terms. But another part of it really is intentionally building a life that really works for me. So both are going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I love that. It's a level of self-awareness and then openness, like accepting what the world is offering you, but also like building and creating that for yourself. It's like, it is twofold. You need both of those, like intentionality and effort. What do you most enjoy about relationships?
I'm a typical American. I've always been a sucker for love. And so in my loving relationships, I just love immersing myself in that feeling of well-being and that positive self-regard, as some therapists call it. But I think even with people I'm just getting to know, there's a joy and a privilege in people letting you into their lives. Like even this conversation between us, that's one reason I'm so excited about it and feel so good about being here today is, getting to know another human being is about the most intriguing, interesting thing one can do compared to all of the other puzzles and challenges in life, like understanding the birth of the universe or the nature of evolution or any of that, because there are so many variables with each one of us. And for somebody to privilege me by allowing me to get to know them, it's just great.
Ooh, I have goosebumps because it is like vulnerability and the ability to just be oneself in front of another human is, we would assume that that's just natural, but it's actually not.
Well, I think to your point, it's natural, but it's also challenging to establish that because I think, our species, we're called a social species, but the famous and Pulitzer Prize winning scientist, Edward O. Wilson, he said we're a eusocial species, spelled E-U, and then the word social, in that we are consumed with an altruism, which you don't see too much in the news, but we do have an altruistic desire to connect and to be there for each other. And when we're in that zone every day, life gets pretty magical. It just feels like an endless high because, as I think all of us know, the best drugs are the ones manufactured by our own body. And when we're really living the way, when we're living the way we're supposed to be living, the joy and the happiness and the serenity and all of that, and the excitement, it's just endless and it's endlessly maintainable. It's a very sustainable lifestyle.
Thank you for that. Like I love the idea that someone like yourself who has a lot of academia and a lot of science-backed information and knowledge, but you're also speaking to the magic of life, which is something like that's the language I speak, is life is magic. And we're very privileged to be able to experience humanity on this level. Like I just moved to LA and I signed my lease about a month and a half ago. And I was so excited because today I finally introduced myself to my last neighbor. There's 8 of us in the building. And yesterday I introduced myself to another neighbor and she was like, I have been here forever. And my boyfriend's been telling me to like introduce myself to my neighbors. And I was like, I love the fact that I'm like, I know all of my neighbors in my building. Now I say hi to them. And just that little moment of like going to grab my coffee and waving and saying like, good morning and knowing their name feels so good. And it's a part of my perfect day, honestly.
Yeah. So. I think, when we talk about ourselves as humans, when we look at the contrast with people who are incapable of that kind of connection, that's where we start using the word inhuman. So my admonition to my clients is understanding that although there are many human-shaped objects in the world, not all of us are capable of humanity, of being truly human with one another. And it's the wise person who sets out to learn to discern the difference between those who are capable of receiving love and the sad millions who are incapable of receiving love.
I want to bring that up in the bigger conversation that we're going to have. Okay. I just want to get through these last few icebreakers, but that's definitely a topic I want to speak about, is the ability to receive and give love. So that leads to the next question. How do you like to show love?
Again, it's just, I feel a little sheepish talking to you about this because I'm the kind of person who wears my heart on my sleeve. So if I love somebody, one of my old professors criticized me saying, you just tend to gush. And that is true of me. I tend to gush because I think most of us are like those scared little monkeys, in the jungle who really need encouragement to take the risk because we're afraid of the unknown. And I think it's so important to be affirming and tell people what you like, even if you've already told them 1,000 times before. I think it's important to repeat that. I don't get tired of people saying I love you, when they mean it sincerely. I don't get tired of people telling me something I said really helped them, and vice versa. I'm surrounded by courageous, wise, loving people, and I tell them so all the time because I so appreciate them. it would be like, the old joke about the guy whose wife was wondering if he still loved her. And he said, well, I told you I loved you when we first got together, didn't I? Well, I'll let you know when it changes. And that's so the opposite of what I'm talking about, right? Because we're not just machines where we get the data in and okay, this person loves me. I'm good until I hear otherwise. No, it doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe in love at first sight?
Yes and no. It depends. I feel like I'm at a Senate congressional hearing. If by love, you mean that gush of positive regard that we used to experience, say, in grade school, where you see somebody and all of a sudden you have a thing for them, or you're crushing on your teacher or whoever it is, that is a form of love. Mm-hmm. But it's not what we mean by the full deal, the real thing. Mm-hmm. Because of the obvious truth that when we fall in love at first sight, we really don't know the other person. And so I can love somebody even platonically, like a new friend. I can love them at first sight. And then I find out he has a paranoid personality disorder. Oh, that's going to make this a high maintenance relationship. And I don't like that, but I can still have the love as long as I can maintain boundaries and have, the knowledge about how to handle this. Yeah, I do believe in love at first sight.
My last icebreaker, which then leads into the conversation, is how do you define intimacy?
That's a simple one. And I actually have a book that I'm going to promote, but nobody's going to be able to find it.
Yeah.
So Enhancing Intimacy in Marriage. This is by Dennis Bargarozzi. And he's an American who wrote it something like 23 years ago. And he defined intimacy as the ability to safely share my life with another person. So I grew up in the golden age of television back in the 60s. And back then, whenever the word intimacy was used in a TV drama like a Perry Mason show, it was always as a euphemism for doing it, for sex. Mm-hmm. And I like Bargarozzi's idea so much better because so many of us are misled when we do have sex or we do have that falling in love at first sight followed by sex. We actually think to ourselves, at last, I have found this person I've been looking for my whole life, my soulmate, and now we can have a truly intimate relationship. But no, the jury's still out on that one. It takes time, and it's like building a house. You don't just drive by with a pickup and start throwing lumber onto the job site and call that a house. You have to build it. It has to be intentional. And sometimes you have to accept that, this other person isn't really what I thought they were. They're not really capable of this. So if that's true, then you have to successfully detach, unplug, and move on with your life and kind of tell the waiter of the universe next.
Mm-hmm. So, Stephen, before we jump into, I wanted to talk about intimacy, love languages, emotional and intellectual intelligence when it comes to sexuality. But before we go into those conversations, can you introduce yourself, what you do, and who you work with?
Sure. For the last 35 plus years, I've been a marriage and family therapist. My last name sounds very Asian. It's not. Although I've been willing to use that to mislead Asian potential girlfriends in the past. So sure, I'm half Chinese. But it's actually Scandinavian, and it refers to Old Norse, and it refers to the Norse god of fertility. So it kind of makes sense because I specialize in working with sexual issues. And that in particular includes things that don't seem sexual, because if you're fixated on intercourse as being sexuality, then my definition isn't going to really make sense. But if you think of sexuality as being the full range of human experiences that pertain to sexuality, such as mate selection or your belief system, all of those, I think, have to do with sexuality. And so life is much bigger and much more complex with that definition, but it's also much more helpful than thinking of life as somewhere on a scale of G-rated films all the way up to XXX rated films, because managing our love lives intelligently, I think it requires us to be thinking of all of these things. So that's what I've been doing the last 35 years. And it's really changed me because my father was a career criminal. So anybody who goes to my website can read my life story in brief. It's not going to be painfully long. But in my family, both sides of my family were crime families. They were both very scary and very dangerous and somewhat infamous, even nationally. So I'm going to let everybody in on the fact that for me, just wondering what is normal, that was always a question in the back of my mind. And how can I find love and maintain love? Those were questions that never got an answer in my family of origin. So when I became a therapist, it's kind of Freudian, and I'm not a Freudian, but I ended up gravitating to working with men because I could never help my dad. He died in a police homicide when I was 12. But when I realized I couldn't help him, but I could help all those other children whose fathers were criminally involved, that really kind of worked for me. And I've always loved working with, I guess you could call them bad boys in that sense, although many of them are much nicer, kinder than I am. But they've gotten in trouble with the law. So the clinical term would be mine is a forensic practice. And I work with, I would say 90% of my clients are men who have either gone to prison or just getting out of prison. And some of them I've worked with, for a very brief time, and others I've worked with for years. But they are all looking to learn to manage their love lives intelligently.
Wow. It's very unique. You probably have one of the most niche specific body of work of all of the people I've interviewed, for sure. Like, you really have a very specific and very rare. Like, I don't think when Megan gave me the brief of you and what your work was, because I found you on Instagram, but I didn't know this part of your work. And so she was giving me a brief and I was like, that's so fascinating. And it's something I don't think people call to mind when they're thinking about human sexuality, intimacy, intelligence, emotional connection to our sexuality. And I think the work that you do is both preventative and recovery. And I think there's so much of that people can easily dismiss certain bodies of humans and communities or pockets of people as just being bad.
Oh, yeah.
And then they don't deserve
irredeemable
the support.
They need to be exiled to an island off of the coast somewhere or all hanged by the neck. But, I'm inspired by, of all people, Betty Ford, the former first lady in the 70s. And I remember the years, I remember all of, let's say, the 20 years before that time when alcoholics and drug addicts were considered scum of the universe. And no one in America had anything positive or redeeming to say about that population. And then comes Betty Ford, who is out with her alcohol problem and her drug problem. And she transformed the consciousness of this country with one fell swoop. It was remarkable. I mean, I don't think anybody really is going to remember her husband as a president. I don't think he's particularly significant, but she changed the world, because when you change America, you change the way the world looks at things. And I think to go from thinking of drug addicts as the lowest of the low to thinking of them compassionately with people who never wanted to be drug addicts, but that they somehow ended up that way, and now how can we help them? And that has really changed America. It's changed me. But it's the same mechanism that helps me work with those accused of criminal behavior in regard to their sexuality. When they were little boys and girls, they were not ever going to answer, yeah, I want to be a sex offender when I grow up. I mean, none of them said that, but they all ended up there. And the question to them is just as confusing as it would be to the rest of us. How did this happen? And I hope it doesn't come across as painfully self-promoting, but I did start a podcast. I've only done 2 seasons of Sex Crime Central, which is sort of a tip of the hat to Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, but where I go through case by case describing how individual little boys grow up to commit sex crimes, and crimes they'd never wished they had committed, crimes they'd never even fantasized they never fantasize the way I fantasize about being a international jewel thief. They have never fantasized about being sex offenders, and yet there they are. And so there has to be some sort of rational explanation, because the alternative is really, I think, the explanation a lot of boyfriends and girlfriends use to talk about their exes. They're just a bad person. They were inspired by evil. They're just so very bad and wrong and evil and selfish and self-centered and all these other things that really don't help us to understand the individual, nor do they help us to predict future behavior. So when we really understand what is needed for humans to develop normally in a sexual way, then we can begin to predict who's going to have a hard time. And that is something that would make our whole society safer, but especially people listening to this right now. If they could really begin to understand how people came to be who they are sexually, it really helps to understand who can change, who's really not capable of changing, and deciding, do you want to be the boyfriend, the girlfriend, the lover, or did you really want to be the therapist in this contact? Because as I've told my current wife when we were first dating, I really just want to be the boyfriend.
Yeah, I'm curious of that too, of your work, because it must affect your own relationships and like your own marriage. And I've not dated someone who is a therapist, but I have a friend who's both of her parents are therapists, and she had a very big aversion for a period of like not wanting to seek therapy because she was like, So yeah. I was curious of how that affected your.
Oh, I myself, I had so many flaws. I'm so grateful you never met me when I was younger, but then you couldn't have because you were way too young. But I was very opinionated. I was also growing up in an alcoholic family. My own early childhood trauma was resolved by my becoming compulsively a rescuer and also compulsively a workaholic and something of a compulsive caretaker. So I always despised therapy and psychotherapy in particular as something for the weak and really very foolish. And luckily I had a great friend when I was in my young 30s who could see I was hurting, and even when I couldn't see it. And he invited me to join him at some 12-step groups. And I went to AA, I went to Al-Anon, which is for friends and family of alcoholics. And then I also went to adult children of alcoholics. And I was sitting there in those rooms. It took maybe 10 sessions for me to realize, oh my God, I'm here for me. I'm not here to take care of everyone else. And then I was like another one of those monkeys I was talking about, where I was really anxious about the door getting kicked in and our parents coming in and saying, how dare you talk about these things? Because it's such a rule violation to talk about how screwed up your family is and how screwed up you are as a result of that experience. Yeah. So, and I got past that, but eventually I was so strongly influenced by that experience of healing that I decided I got to become a therapist. This stuff is really great. So it was in my late 30s that I became a therapist.
It's funny too that coming from dysfunctional family, a lot of what would stereotypically be called the black sheep is often the person that's trying to heal or change or shift the narrative or try to talk about some of the family secrets. And yet then they get labeled as black sheep, or they're weird, or they get shunned for that. And then they carry that burden of like, I'm the black sheep. I don't fit in. There's something wrong with me, or I'm not playing the game anymore. And then,
well, even just wanting to talk about it, even just wanting to talk about any of these subjects, whether you have insight or you don't, but you're just wanting to figure it out loud with the help of family and friends, you can easily get labeled as the big weirdo in the family.
Yep. And like pushed aside or told like, you're not playing the rules of the game, and we don't talk about that, or we don't do that, or we just ignore such and such as problem or whatever. And then they carry that burden of being the black sheep. And then it's really beautiful to see that black sheep actually recognize you're not actually the black sheep, and you can heal and separate. And then hopefully with the hope of influencing the family versus fixing the family. Right. So turning the black sheep into just the light versus feeling like you have to carry the burden of either continuing that story of like, oh, there's something wrong with me and I have to continue destructive behavior isolated, or, not trying to fix everybody or cover things up. It's really interesting to see that, like, a lot of people who feel that or feel not within the family norm going off and becoming healers in some way, shape, or form.
Yes. And to help the listeners out there with another suggested reading, I really don't recommend Barghotsi's book so much because it's probably out of print, and it's really written from a very dry clinical point of view. But there is a psychiatrist named Gabor Mate, M-A-T-E, who wrote In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, which is a metaphor from the Buddhist beliefs of people in the afterlife constantly being starved for something, and they keep eating, but the food keeps falling out of their incorporeal bodies, their spectral bodies. So they're forever hungry, but never able to become satiated. And I think that that's really a great metaphor for those of us who grew up with early childhood trauma and then still haven't figured out who we are, how we survived that trauma, whether it was somewhat less than other people's trauma or greater than other people's trauma is not really the point, because I think we all had some trauma, and then we get into some sort of compulsive behavior that was helpful when we were younger, but is the opposite of everything we need in terms of being successful in our intimate relationships as adults.
Let's take a quick break. Are you tired of the hormonal roller coaster that comes with birth control pills? 11 years ago, I decided to ditch hormonal birth control and embark on a journey to find a more natural alternative. Over the years, I've used condoms, calendar tracking methods, and withdrawal, which can sometimes be pretty risky and stress-inducing practices. However, I've discovered a game changer, Natural Cycles. It's an FDA-cleared birth control app that has brought me peace of mind like never before. Whether you're planning or preventing pregnancy, Natural Cycles has got your back. Let's talk about numbers for a moment, even though I hate numbers. Natural Cycles is 98% effective when used properly. And here's the best part. You're not putting any extra hormones into your body. It's all about understanding your cycle and making informed decisions. Ready to start your hormone-free birth control journey? Use the link in our episode description to get 15% off the annual subscription for Natural Cycles. That's right, 15% off to take charge of your reproductive health in a natural and effective way. Say goodbye to those hormonal ups and downs and hello to a birth control approach that aligns with your body.
Not all lubes are created the same. Here at Head South, we've worked diligently to pare down the ingredients so there is no fuss and no unnecessary bits and bobs. Head South Intimacy Serums make it simple and easy for you to reduce friction and enhance pleasure. Listeners can get 20% off their first order of a starter kit using the code PODCAT24. That's PODCAT24. And now, back to the episode.
That actually leads me to the article that I read this morning that kind of shifted my whole purview of what I wanted to interview you on, is the article that you wrote for Psychology Today about the 5 love languages, because it's a very hot button topic. And I think it's something I had heard about maybe in 2016. Someone had been like, oh, did you read this book? And people were getting into it, and it's become even more so. It's kind of one of those, I call it like the therapy speak on Instagram. It's like now people are self-diagnosing. Now people are like, this is the only way, like, oh, I only do acts of service, or people are, and the same thing, like I believe in astrology. I love astrology, but I think if you don't understand the full depth, like, no, you're not just a Gemini and I'm not just a Cancer. We're more than just these little labels that we're putting on ourselves. But I do find that, like, in some ways, these things have been beneficial in communication, or just a little bit more understanding, or having some information that helps you feel like, oh yeah, I do like this. But what I liked about your article, and I have to fully agree with it, it's not just any one or two things like, oh, I'm just acts of service and words of affirmation, and don't even look at me if you want to give me a gift, or, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think relationship works that way. And I can say that in the fact, I have a very clear example of that. I was in a relationship with someone for a long period of time, and it was secret. And so that relationship was never validated to the greater public. But this person actually offered me all 5 of the love languages, let's say. Like there was never any of those love languages that didn't go back and forth, that wasn't reciprocal. But the shield and the lack of validation of existing in this person's world in that role of partner, it didn't matter how many acts of service, how many gifts, how many words of affirmation, how much affection. It didn't matter at the end of the day. And I recognized then that like, oh yeah, those love languages are good for like a little bit of understanding, but it doesn't fulfill like the level of intimacy and the level of, I think as a human, I just like validation, being seen and heard by a partner means more, and how we receive and give love. So you brought that up at the beginning of our conversation. And I think it's not about these specific 5 things because there's so much more available, or there's very nuanced ways of expressing love. But I really appreciated that article because it did pinpoint the idea that like it's more about being able to receive and give and communicate love, and never letting it just be like, I told you that one time I loved you, and or we moved on from that phase, the honeymoon phase, and now we're this, without actually just checking in with your partner and fulfilling their needs and fulfilling your own needs and expressing them. So I would love for you to chat a little bit about that article and your take on the 5.
I was just enjoying listening to you talk about it. I think that it's, it's what you said though is, again, something I would want to emphasize. But let me start off on a negative note in that I think of the 5 love language, it was originally designed by a clergyman, Protestant pastor, and it really doesn't have a basis in science. And that was the springboard for the article, that the research indicates that no, it's not really a thing. It's not helpful. It doesn't really work for people. So in that sense, it's a scam, and it's a scam like so many other pop books that do you remember? No, you were probably much too young when Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus came out.
I remember it. I was in grade school, but I do remember.
Okay. So again, he made millions of dollars off his book. And where are we today? Well, the market has moved on to the next shiny thing. And I think part of it is part of what's going on in our culture is that people are so desperate to have some sort of insight to make love work that we reach for the snake oil that's most popular nowadays. And there was a time when it was Men Are From Mars, and then it became the love languages, and there'll be something else, tomorrow. And whatever that is, it's probably already out there on the market. But we ourselves, there was a poet, Alexander Pope, who was kind of the poet laureate of the Enlightenment period. And he said, the proper study of mankind is man. So if we were just to look at ourselves, if humanity could just look at itself and figure out, just by thinking mindfully and more self-awareness, we would figure these things out on our own. We don't really need experiments, and we really don't need somebody else telling us to answer that question. That's a common question, by the way, in AA, where they lean forwards and they say, usually when you're saying something really stupid, they'll say, so how's that working for you? And
yeah.
and when you talk about this secret love of yours, if you've been in a friendship with someone who understood that you weren't really satisfied and really happy, it must have been wonderfully exciting and titillating at first, and really wonderful for so many reasons, initially, but then to lean in and say, so how's that working for you? After many months had gone by, you would have been, well, it would have been a more nuanced answer. And we all have that experience. We've all had that experience. And so it just seems like a fully functional human being would really be able to hoover up love and see that love is in the room wherever it's offered, in whatever way it's offered. So that if your mate or would-be mate, let's say, is looking at you with eyes of love, just a loving glance should communicate love. A tender, loving tone in the voice, to me, communicates love. And then, of course, besides all that body language, which is huge, there's also the actual language of being able to say, no, I really love you, where you sincerely and and meaningfully in the proper context. So that really, for me, is part of being a really functional human being, and that we're adaptive and we can see where the love is, regardless of whether it's within our tradition or not. If my love language is, I'm thinking of the person whose love language is his mom always used to cook for him. And so the act of service and cooking for him is when he really feels loved. I've even had clients who feel loved with something as simple as when the refrigerator is full. When it's just jam-packed with food, that's when he feels loved. And yet you get to know his wife. Anybody who got to know his wife or his girlfriend or significant other of whatever gender, and you realize, oh no, they're very loving and they're loving in lots of different ways. Why aren't any of these ways working for you? And that usually goes back to early childhood trauma. Right? That's not working. Because we're all capable of being adaptive that way. We just have to learn how to do it.
That's so important, because I think that is a lot of what people are seeing, these like things on social media, on TikTok, and being like, oh, it's this. And then I've witnessed people fighting and arguing with their partners. Well, like, you're not doing it this way, or it's because you are this.
Right.
And it's what was intended, or I think what is helpful about being informed or having some of these things to communicate is to build connection, not to kind of hold things against one another or use it as an argument point. Because I've always loved this piece of advice of, it's not win or lose in a relationship. It's not about like who's right and wrong. Like, I always try to get people to understand that, because if someone's right, then someone is automatically wrong, if like that's your stance in any relationship, versus like trying to just understand where the person's coming from. And I think when someone starts to use these tools or information like that, and especially what you're saying, where there's like no scientific backing, and also there's not a lot of diversity that the people are finding, and there's not a lot of research or cultural diversity. So the love languages don't translate, because it probably was started and created within that congregation, which is probably a very specific congregation of people under a very specific belief system. Like, I didn't know that it came from a religious clergyman. I had no idea about that. So that makes a lot of sense. But I think what a lot of people are utilizing these kind of therapy speak, or like, you're gaslighting me, but you're like misuse and utilizing therapy talk, like boundaries and things like that. When it's like, that's not actually a boundary. That's you trying to control another person.
Yeah.
There's all of these little things happening through social media, which is like, in one way, it would be great if that led somebody to pursue therapy, like making it more accessible, or more like, oh yeah, we're all talking about mental health in a very different way than we were 5, 10, 15 years ago.
That is true.
I think it's great. But I think it's when people see like an Instagram video, and then that's like, they hold that to be true, versus getting the support they need, the mediation they need, the communication skills, I think is where we're failing. I think in terms of like relational understanding is like, I think when people start weaponizing the therapy speak, it can become complicated or misunderstood, or I think using love language is like, you're not providing me with acts of service. I think it's really funny in a way.
No, I can't agree more. I mean, obviously you've thought about this a lot, and I have to agree with everything that you're saying. I even know therapists who gaslight their partners, and it's so very wrong. And it just tells me that they have so much unfinished business of their own healing for them to engage in that kind of behavior. You know, whether we're in a monogamous partnership, or for some people, polyamory is the answer. But whatever kind of partnerships we get into, the whole strategy there was to form a strategic alliance with the other in order to face life's challenges more effectively, more efficiently, and to solve life's problems so that we could go forward as a family. And when we are attacking each other, we're living out the antithesis of that whole idea. So the way I visualize it is that there's a sacred bubble that envelops you and your partner, me and my partner. And within that bubble, we are a couple. And that all of our problems are outside of that bubble, even if I'm the one manifesting the behavior that's considered problematic. That behavior is not my identity. I am much more than merely the things that I do, or especially the things that I do that are harmful or self-centered or selfish. I'm much more than that. And that's our journey in this world, isn't it? To learn to rise above those things and to become better and better at being a loving person. So Edward O. Wilson, who I've quoted before, he says that psychology is absolutely the most complex science of all and will be the last one for us to master. I think that's why it's part science and part art to this very day.
Mm.
It's that magic you were speaking of in human relationships that seems to be better addressed almost with alchemy. And if somebody could really, he says that's because physics has relatively few variables, and that was the first real science. And then chemistry coming after that, and biology coming after that. And with each level of scientific exploration, the number of variables gets more and more. And so now with love, I mean, just between you and me, we each have so many life variables. You were born in an era that is really kind of utterly different from my own, my family experience, my siblings, the religious influences, the friendships, all the rest of it. Oh my gosh, there's no end to it. And then you add to that your own insight and your own evolution as a human being. And so, yeah, we don't have, and this is again Wilson's observation, that we simply don't have the computational power to really understand human psychology the way we can understand, say, something in the environment, which is challenging enough, right? It's really hard enough to get a consensus there, but we're still a long ways away from really nailing it. We've never really studied ourselves. And I think that goes back, well, I'm going to get really boring here, so you may need to stop me, but I think it goes back to the Enlightenment, because ages ago, Spain and Portugal divided the world up into two regions, and one was going to be Spain and the other one was going to be Portugal's property. And it never occurred to them there might be the rest of the planet that might want some say in that. And in the same way, during the Enlightenment scientists claimed physics and chemistry and that sort of thing. And so there was to be no more putting Galileo, or the Galileo of our ages, into prisons, as he was put into prison the last few years of his life, that we were going to be supportive of scientific endeavor, with the exception of ethics, morality, and human sexuality. And the church claimed to have provenance over those areas. And I think for a variety of reasons, the people in the Enlightenment said, okay, good enough. And so to this very day, we have a hard time really being rational about sexuality and about our love lives. And instead, we depend so much on revelation. And that's why we don't blink when somebody recommends a book like The 5 Love Languages, because, well, why wouldn't a pastor know exactly the answer that we're all looking for? Well, like for 10 million different reasons. I could think of a lot of reasons he might not know, because his truth is based on revelation, not reason. So he read a book, and in the book were all the answers one would need to lead one's life. It's just that, well, only 1 billion out of 8 billion people believe that. And so the other 7 billion have to find a different book. And they do. And so depending on revelation for answers just seems hopelessly problematic. Because you're essentially, it's like depending on the tooth fairy or Santa Claus leading you into some sort of rational understanding of what to expect. And that just doesn't work.
So what is your advice to someone who, let's say it's a couple and they're communicating through the love languages? What is your advice to them?
Well, if they really are communicating, they probably don't need to be coming into my office. But there's a problem even with that one paradigm of you two have a communication problem, because that's a mindset taught by therapists, right? We've trained America to think that we all have a communication problem and we need to learn how to communicate better. I think most of the time that's simply not true. Most of the time we both speak English pretty fluently. so we can communicate just as well as you and I are communicating right now. And instead, I think it's really more, when I think of couples, I think couples so often are made up of two individuals who really don't know themselves or the other as well as they should. And so many couples are flummoxed by the idea of being asked, so what do you really need in this relationship? And they really don't, they may have a wonderful vocabulary, but they don't have a working vocabulary of words in their mouth, sentences in their brain that would express what it is they're looking for. So I don't think it's a communication problem precisely. I think it's more of a self-awareness problem. Yeah.
I was going to say it's a self-awareness where it's the inability to understand our feelings, intellectualize those feelings, and then speak them, because we can talk and wax poetic all day about certain things of this in the dishwasher and cleaning this and taking the dog out. In the same vein of like, how's that working for you? I often find myself asking friends, well, how does that feel? And then they just continue intellectualizing things. They don't actually tune into their feelings and say, like, expressing what that feeling is like in their body, what that feels like within them. They don't know how to tune into their feelings. They'll just keep intellectualizing the argument or the thing that they're expressing about their partner. And I'm like, but how does that make you feel?
Oh yeah. You know, and I'm as human as the next. And no matter what my ex-wife says, I'm as human as the next person. And I have a tendency to over-intellectualize or to rest in my head rather than paying attention to what's really feeling right or good or proper for myself. And I've ignored my feelings for many, many years. And it's coming out of that mindset is really a process, right? It's not an event. It takes practice. But, you know, my problem for people isn't the whole love language thing is a non-starter. And instead, I just urge people to do an intentional interview of say a leading applicant who's applying for a role, supporting role in your life, and to really get to know that person in a way that really would make sense. And that's something I guess we could talk about on another day. What would that look like to really conduct an intentional interview? And how long would that last? I would argue it should probably last for a lifetime, because we humans are constantly growing and evolving and changing, or sadly, devolving or changing for the worse. So we need to constantly be getting to know each other.
Truly. And getting to know ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because there's so many truths about myself I haven't been ready to look at until I get to a certain age. And then I go, oh, well, that's interesting. I guess I do need that.
Yeah. And then we're lucky enough to have a partner who could witness, support, and be a part of that journey.
Right.
And
or that thing,
provide the space for that
I used to like, oh, it no longer works for me. And so, yeah, we're both evolving, and it's challenging. It's like evolving in a relationship is like evolving as a team of jugglers, and we're on stage and we're actually performing, and somehow we've got to keep those balls or rolling pins or whatever it is that we're juggling, chainsaws. We've got to keep them up in the air without getting ourselves hurt. And it's really challenging, but it's so much easier if we can be safe, you know, where we lower the anxiety, and that allows us to be so much more truly rational. I think the foundation of a truly rational approach to life is an emotional foundation. And that emotional foundation is feeling calm and at peace with whatever the answer is. In other words, a sense of equanimity. Oh, she still loves me. How great. Oh, she doesn't love me anymore. Oh, I can accept that. And to where it's okay either way, right? And that takes some evolving and maturing as a human being to get there.
I appreciate that so much, because I think a lot of people completely remove rationality and emotionality. And it's actually...
No, it's because our brain is made up of both. Equanimity. And if you don't have the emotional part in sync, it's as if no matter what your spirituality is, if you don't integrate your spirituality with your sexuality, you're asking for real problems. I mean, the brain has to be vertically integrated for me to have my best and happiest life. And that includes my emotions. I can't be looking at a spreadsheet and say, well, I should be loving this relationship. So, okay, I guess I'll just shut up now. I won't complain. And it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. I hate to wrap it up, but we have to wrap it up because I know you have a time limit. Stephen, this has been such a pleasure to chat with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. How do people find you?
There's so many, I've got so much content out there in books, podcasts, articles. So might I suggest if people wanted, if you haven't had enough of Stephen Ing already, then you could go to stephening.com and you'll find a portal to the entire world of my content, which is pretty exhausting. So it's not something anybody's going to digest in an afternoon or two. And the reason I do that is because I really want the world to enjoy being human and to enjoy being in love and to enjoy sexuality. And we should be able to figure this out. I mean, most of the other animals have figured out their own needs and how to be who they are, but we haven't. And I think there's some really practical reasons for that. So that's why I keep working at my incredibly advanced age and I will never retire because I really think that's really what it's all about. And I think it's part of the explanation why our country is so divided right now, that we haven't done that. So stephening.com and you'll find everything else right there.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I appreciate your time and this conversation so much. And hopefully we'll have you on the podcast again.
I would love that, Kat. It's been just a joy talking to you.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
If you're looking for me, I'm heading south. All year round I'm going down. Now you know where I'll be, I'm heading south. So come on, look me right in the